the night Genevieve Okafor walked into the wrong boardroom and accidentally sat in on a meeting she absolutely was not supposed to attend. 3 things happened in quick succession. A man in a charcoal suit looked up from a stack of financial documents. The entire room went quiet. And Genevieve, who had been clutching a tray of coffee orders for the 14th floor executives, spilled an Americano down the front of her blouse. That was how it started. Not with fireworks, not with destiny. With coffee, a wrong turn, and a room full of people who looked at her the way people had been looking at her entire life. Like she was furniture that had somehow wandered into the wrong house. Genevieve was 31 years old, a junior forensic accountant at Harlow & Crane Financial Group in downtown Toronto, and she had spent the better part of 6 years being the smartest person in every room she was told she didn't belong in. She was full-figured, dark-haired, and possessed of a laugh that her mother called generous and her colleagues called inconvenient. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting from the University of Waterloo, a near-perfect memory for numbers, and a habit of noticing things that other people's pride made them blind to. She also, as of that Tuesday morning in November, had an Americano-stained blouse and the full unwanted attention of Luca Varro. Most people in Toronto's financial district knew the name Varro the way they knew the name of a storm system, with a particular mix of dread and reluctant respect. Luca Varro was 43, Italian-Canadian by way of his grandfather's side, and had built an empire so diversified and so deliberately opaque that 3 separate federal investigators had spent years trying to find the edges of it and had come back empty-handed. He ran legitimate operations in real estate, private equity, and import logistics. He also ran things that did not appear on any registry or tax filing, and in certain rooms, in certain parts of the city, the word Varro was enough to end a conversation before it started. Genevieve knew none of this. She had a meeting to get to on the 14th floor, a blouse that was now ruined, and the singular misfortune of having a near photographic memory that had, in the 10 seconds she'd been standing in that boardroom doorway, already processed the numbers on the document closest to her. She wished later that she had been less gifted. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong in the way that people make arithmetic mistakes. Wrong in the precise, deliberate, expert way that someone builds a false structure to hold weight it was never meant to carry. She recognized the pattern the way a musician recognizes a wrong note. Instantly, physically, in the chest. She backed out of the room. She went to the women's restroom on the 14th floor. She stood over the sink and told herself she had imagined it. She had not imagined it. Genevieve had been hired at Harlow & Crane by a man named Douglas Fitch, who had been her supervisor for 2 years and had, in those 2 years, done exactly one thing that could be called generous. He had hired her at all. Every other interaction had been a small, precise lesson in how little space she was expected to take up. When she flagged irregularities in the Ashmore portfolio, Douglas had told her the seniors had already reviewed it. When she'd submitted her analysis of the Belhaven Trust restructuring, an analysis that, she later learned, had been passed upward without her name on it, Douglas had told her she needed to develop a broader perspective before she could be trusted with client-facing work. When the holiday party photograph was posted on the firm's internal site, Genevieve had been cropped out. She had told none of this to her friend Yusuf, who worked in IT and ate lunch with her in the 7th floor break room every Thursday, because Yusuf worried, and Genevieve had spent so much of her life reassuring people who worried about her that she had gotten quite good at performing fine. "You look like someone replaced your regular coffee with bad news," Yusuf said on the Thursday after the boardroom incident, dropping into the chair across from her with a container of leftover jollof rice. "I'm thinking," Genevieve said. "You're always thinking. That's the problem." She smiled at her sandwich. She did not tell him about the numbers. She did not tell him about the man in the charcoal suit, whose eyes had tracked her across the boardroom with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not cold, not warm, not the usual flicker of dismissal she'd learned to expect. Something else. something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. She went back to her desk and pulled up the publicly available filings for Varro Capital Holdings. She told herself she was being thorough. She told herself she was imagining things. By 7 o'clock that evening, she had found 4 more anomalies and had stopped telling herself anything at all. The second time she saw Luca Varro, she was not carrying coffee. She was leaving the office at 8:15 on a Wednesday, which was late even by Harlow and Crane's standards, and she was wearing the expression of a woman who had spent 3 hours convincing herself to do the sensible thing and had failed. The sensible thing was to delete her notes, go home, make tea, and never think about any of it again. Instead, she had printed a 12-page summary and put it in her bag. He was standing by the elevator bank. She registered this with the same calm she used when she registered anything alarming, which was to say, a preternatural stillness of face that her mother called composure and her former boyfriend had called unnerving. Luca Varro was taller than he had seemed in the boardroom. His suit was different, dark navy this time, and he was alone, which was notable because men like him were almost never alone. He was looking at his phone when she walked up, and then he wasn't. "The coffee woman," he said. "The forensic accountant," she replied, and pressed the button for the lobby. There was a pause. "Those are different job titles." "They are." The elevator arrived. She stepped in. He stepped in. The doors closed. "You were in that room for approximately 8 seconds, he said, not looking at her, his eyes on the floor indicator. "What did you see?" Genevieve had a choice. She could say nothing. She could say she hadn't seen anything. She could make the sensible decision that she'd been failing to make for 4 days. "Enough," she said. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Luca Varro stepped out and held the door with one hand and looked at her with an expression that she would spend a long time afterwards trying to name. "I'll send a car tomorrow morning," he said. 7 a.m. "Don't be late." She watched him walk across the marble lobby and out through the revolving doors. Then she stood in the open elevator for a moment longer than was strictly dignified. She was not afraid. She was, which was perhaps more alarming, curious. The car was a black Escalade. The driver did not speak. Genevieve sat in the back with her 12-page summary in her bag and a travel mug of tea, and reminded herself that she had an extremely good memory for faces, that she had texted Yusuf the license plate number with the message, "If I don't text you by noon, call the police," and that, whatever else was true, she knew things that were valuable, and valuable things had a way of protecting their owners. She was taken to an office building on King Street West that looked like a law firm from the outside, and something else entirely from the inside. All dark wood and controlled silence, and the particular quality of air that suggested nothing that happened here would leave. She was led to a corner office on the 8th floor. She was offered coffee, which she declined on the grounds that she was not going to be undone by a beverage again. Luca Varro was already there. He was standing at the window, looking out at the lake, and he turned when she came in with the same quality of attention she'd noticed before, complete, unhurried, as though she were the only thing in the room worth looking at. She found this in a deeply inconvenient way, difficult to dismiss. "Sit," he said, and then, a beat later, as though he'd caught himself, "Please." She sat. She put her bag on her lap. She looked at him across the desk and waited because she had learned a long time ago that the person who spoke first in a silent room almost always lost. He studied her. "You saw the anomalies in the Fenwick file. The Fenwick file and 3 related entities," she said. Holloway Venture Trust, the 2021 Meridian restructuring, and a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands that is trying very hard to look like a dormant holding vehicle and is not. Silence. "What are they hiding?" he asked. "Money," she said. "Yours specifically. Someone inside your organization has been skimming for approximately 18 months. The amounts are small enough individually that they clear standard review thresholds. Collectively," she opened her bag and set the 12 pages on the desk. "Collectively, they've moved approximately $4.7 million into a structure that you don't own and didn't authorize." Luca Varro looked at the document. Then he looked at her. How long did it take you to find this? 4 evenings. The first one was mostly convincing myself I hadn't seen it. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Who else have you told? No one. I thought about going to the OSC, she paused. I decided to come to you first. Why? Genevieve folded her hands on the table. Because whoever is doing this works inside your organization, which means that whoever I report it to externally will get ahead of me before I finish the sentence, and I'll spend the next 2 years being buried in an investigation that benefits everyone except me. She looked at him steadily, and because it occurred to me that a man who built what you've built probably has strong opinions about people stealing from him. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shadow of one, which was, she suspected, as close as he got. You're not what I expected, he said. People frequently aren't, she said, when you haven't been looking at them properly. She did not expect to be involved further. She had handed over her analysis. She had done the sensible, or arguably the least insensible, thing, and she assumed that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. The calls began 3 days later. Not threatening calls. Working calls, Luca Varro or his assistant sending documents, asking questions, requesting second opinions on financial structures that had nothing to do with the original anomaly. She answered them from her kitchen table, in her apartment in Leslieville, in her pajamas, eating crackers and cheese, because the work was interesting, and because she had never in her professional life been treated as though her opinion was the thing being sought, rather than quietly redirected. Douglas Fitch, meanwhile, had begun to notice her absence from her desk after hours. You've been distracted, he told her on a Friday afternoon, leaning in the doorway of her small office with the particular posture of a man who had mistaken condescension for management. The Bellantine files need your full attention. We can't have junior staff operating outside their lane. Genevieve smiled pleasantly. Of course, she said. I'll have the Bellantine analysis on your desk by Monday. Douglas Fitch nodded, satisfied, and left. Genevieve looked at her screen. The Bellantine analysis was already done. It had been done since Tuesday. On Sunday evening, Luca Varro called her directly, which he had not done before. There's a problem, he said. Which one? A short pause that might, in a different man, have been surprise. The Fenwick situation has moved faster than I anticipated. The person responsible. They know someone found it. Genevieve set down her mug. How? Someone at your firm talked. She went still. She thought about Douglas Fitch, who had been unusually interested in her schedule. She thought about the Bellantine files, which she'd been handed right when she'd started digging. She thought about 6 years of being underestimated and rerouted and quietly shut out. Douglas Fitch, she said. Another pause. Longer this time. We think so, Luca said. Genevieve looked at the wall of her kitchen. She thought about the holiday party photograph with her cropped out of it. She thought about her analysis of the Belhaven Trust with someone else's name on it. She thought about 6 years of being told she wasn't ready, didn't have the perspective, needed to develop broader awareness. All right, she said. Then we need to move the timeline up. We, Luca repeated. Unless you'd like to do the forensic accounting yourself. There was a silence on the line. Then I'll send a car. What happened over the next 72 hours, Genevieve would later have difficulty describing in a linear way, partly because it moved very fast, and partly because she was running on 4 hours of sleep and an amount of adrenaline that she suspected was not recommended for people with her blood pressure. She worked from Luca's King Street office. She had access to the full Varro Capital filing architecture, which was the most complicated financial structure she had ever seen, and was also, she was privately pleased to discover, not as opaque as it was supposed to be once you knew where to look. She found the secondary skimming pathways that she hadn't had visibility into from the outside. She found the third party who had been facilitating the transfers, a mid-level portfolio manager named Easton Briggs, who had apparently been under the impression that he was clever. She found with some satisfaction that he was not. "He's going to run," she said, on the second night at 11:40, over cold takeout containers and a whiteboard covered in her handwriting. "He knows the timeline moved. He'll try to move the funds to the final layer before we can freeze them." Luca was leaning against the desk behind her, looking at the whiteboard. He had removed his jacket at some point in the last several hours, and he was looking at her in that way he had, like she was something he was trying to solve. "Can you get ahead of it?" "Yes," she said, "but I need about 20 minutes and access to the Cayman Correspondent Bank portal, which you have and I don't." He leaned forward and typed in the credentials himself, and stepped back, and Genevieve sat down and started working. 18 minutes later, Easton Briggs' carefully constructed exit ramp, $4.5 million, 18 months of incremental theft, an entire offshore architecture built to outlast any investigation, ceased to exist. The funds were frozen. The trail was clean. The documentation was already formatted for regulatory submission. Genevieve sat back in her chair. "Done," she said. The room was quiet. Outside, the lake was dark, and the city was lit up in the way that Toronto is always lit up at midnight in November, bright and cold and indifferent, and somehow still beautiful. Luca Varro was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the elevator. She had learned by this point to hold it without flinching. "You knew Fitch would come after you for this," he said. "It was not a question. I knew he'd try." "You weren't afraid?" She turned in the chair to look at him properly. "I was afraid," she said. "I've been afraid for most of my career. Being afraid and doing it anyway is not the same as not being afraid." He was quiet for a moment. "Briggs had a partner at the regulatory level," he said, "someone who was going to bury the OSC referral before it cleared intake. We have the documentation now. I'll make sure it reaches the right hands." He paused. "And Douglas Fitch, what about him? He facilitated access that made this possible. He'll be dealt with." Genevieve thought about 6 years. She thought about the photograph and the reports and the small daily accumulation of being made invisible. "I don't want him hurt," she said. "I want him audited, the ghost of that almost smile again. I can arrange that." "Thoroughly," she said. "Comprehensively," he agreed. She went back to her apartment at 2 in the morning. She slept for 10 hours. She woke up to 17 missed calls from Douglas Fitch, a text from Yusuf that said, "Gev, what is happening? There are federal auditors in the office," and a single message from an unsaved number that she now recognized. The message said, "Breakfast. Your choice of location. I'll come to you." She stared at this for longer than she would admit. She texted back, "7 in the morning is not breakfast, it's a threat." The reply came in under a minute. 8. Then, pick somewhere. She picked a place on Queen East that did good eggs and had small tables with bad lighting and no dress code, because she was testing something, and she did not entirely know what. Luca Varro arrived at 8 o'clock in a car that was extremely conspicuous on Queen Street East and in a coat that cost more than Genevieve's rent. He sat down across from her, looked at the menu, and asked the server what they'd recommend. The server, a young woman who did not know or care who he was, told him the mushroom omelette was the move. He ordered the mushroom omelette. Genevieve watched him do this and felt something in her chest do something inconvenient. "I'd like to offer you a position," he said, after the coffee arrived. "Consulting, initially. My financial architecture needs someone who can read what other people can't. I've had 5 analysts working the same files for 3 years, and none of them found what you found in 4 evenings." Genevieve wrapped her hands around her mug. "I found it because I wasn't supposed to be in that room. You tend to pay closer attention when you're where you're not supposed to be. I want you to always be in the room," he said. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "That's a significant offer to make to someone you met a week ago." "I'm aware. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. When Luca Varro was quiet, it was not the silence of someone gathering words. It was the silence of someone deciding how much truth to spend. Because in 30 years of building something that nobody was supposed to be able to see into, he said, "You walked in by accident and saw all of it, and your first instinct wasn't to run, And it wasn't to expose it, and it wasn't to sell the information. You documented it, and you came to me." He paused. "That's not an accountant. That's a partner." Genevieve set her cup down. Outside, Queen Street was doing what it always did on a weekday morning in November, moving fast, indifferent, everybody going somewhere. She had spent 6 years at a firm where she was consistently made to feel like an inconvenience, like a rounding error, like something that could be cropped out of the picture. She had done the work and carried the results, and watched other people receive the credit, and she had told herself it was temporary, that she was building something, that patience was a strategy. She had been patient. She looked at the man across from her, who was not patient in any observable way, but who had, from the moment she'd corrected his title in an elevator, paid attention to her in a way that was less like being observed and more like being heard. "I want a contract," she said, "specific terms. Clear scope, done, and I want the Belhaven analysis credited properly, my name, my work." Something shifted in his face. "I can make that happen." "And," she said, "I want to choose my own hours." The almost smile arrived, and this time it was close enough to real that she catalogued it carefully for later reference. "Within reason," he said. "My reason," she said, "not yours." He looked at her for a moment with that complete, unhurried attention. "Agreed," he said. The mushroom omelettes arrived. They were very good. Genevieve Okafor ate her breakfast, in her neighborhood, in bad lighting and no dress code, and let herself feel, for the first time in 6 years, that the room she was in was one she had every right to be in, not because anyone had told her so, but because she had built, number by painstaking number, the irrefutable proof of her own presence. Somewhere across town, Douglas Fitch was sitting in front of a federal auditor who had a great many questions about the Belhaven Trust and a 12-page summary that had, apparently, originated with a junior forensic accountant he had spent 2 years trying to make invisible. Genevieve did not think about Douglas Fitch. She thought about the next file. She thought about the work. She thought about the particular expression on Luca Varro's face when he'd said partner, like the word was something he didn't use lightly and had chosen with unusual care. She thought she might let herself, in time, believe it.